Ashley took the first step, and the swamp took her boot. She pulled, the mud sucked back, and she wrenched her leg free only to sink deeper with the next stride. Behind her, the group followed in a jagged line, their breathing heavy and irregular. Alaya clutched the map, turning it sideways against the dimming light, while Dana and Tyson struggled to keep their balance on the shifting, unstable floor. Damien brought up the rear, his eyes scanning the dense, tangled wall of cypress and vine. Every step here was a negotiation with the earth. One wrong placement and a boot was gone, trapped in the thick, viscous sludge that coated the base of the trees. They stopped for a moment, chests heaving, as the humidity began to press against them like a physical weight. The air was thick, tasting of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. There was no sound of birds, no rustle of wind, only the wet, rhythmic slap of feet pulling out of the muck. They were deeper in now than the map had promised. Ashley looked back, her face tight, and signaled for them to keep moving. The swamp had already closed the path behind them. They pushed forward, deeper into the dark, tangled silence. The group halted as the light above began to bleed. It started as a faint tremor in the atmosphere, then deepened into a bruised, pulsating violet that rippled across the canopy. Ashley looked up, shielding her eyes, but the glare was not from the sun. It was an intense, unnatural radiation bending through the humid air. The water at their feet shifted from dark brown to a sickly, iridescent neon. Alaya dropped her hand, the map slipping from her fingers into the mud. She did not reach to pick it up. The light cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to detach from the trees and crawl across the surface of the swamp. Tyson stepped back, his boots splashing, but the sound was muffled by the strange pressure in the air. Damien squinted at the horizon, where the sky glowed with a violent, shifting crimson. The heat intensified, making the moisture in the air shimmer like a veil. Every surface, from the gnarled roots to the hanging moss, now burned with an alien, flickering hue. They stood motionless, caught in the middle of a landscape that no longer felt like Earth. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches silhouetted against the burning sky, as if the forest itself were reacting to the sky's transformation. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic popping of gas bubbles breaking the swamp surface, now glowing in the strange light. The violent colors of the sky began to bleed into a bruised, heavy gray. As the sun dipped, the swamp floor transformed into a labyrinth of indistinguishable shadows. Ashley moved to the last known clearing, her eyes scanning for the blazed markers on the cypress trunks. She circled the area, her hands brushing against rough bark, but found nothing but smooth, wet wood. The trail had simply ceased to exist. She stopped, turning slowly to face the others. The reality settled into the group with a cold, sharp finality. The path back was gone. Tyson swept his light across the trees, but the beam died against the dense wall of vines and moss. Every direction looked identical, a repeating pattern of rot and stagnant water. They huddled together, the perimeter of their vision shrinking as the darkness climbed higher into the canopy.
Alia gripped her flashlight until her knuckles whitened,
aiming the narrow beam toward the upper branches. Nothing moved, yet the stillness felt heavy, intentional. They stood back to back, scanning the dark, shifting silhouettes of the trees. The canopy above seemed to knit itself tighter, locking them into a natural cage.
The silence was absolute, save for the sound of their own ragged, shallow breaths.
They were no longer following a trail. They were merely waiting for the night to reveal what had been watching them from the shadows. The silence did not last. It broke with a low, subterranean hum that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Then, the air erupted. Thousands of wings beat against the humid darkness, creating a high-pitched,
relentless drone that filled their ears until it drowned out their own voices. Ashley clamped her hands over her head,
but the sound was everywhere, a thick, living cloud of noise. Dana waved a frantic hand in front of her face. swatting at invisible swarmers that collided with her skin. The flashlights cut through the heavy air, revealing millions of tiny, iridescent bodies swirling in the beams. They were no longer standing in a forest. They were trapped inside a pulsating,
swarming cage. Alaya staggered backward, her beams swinging wildly as she tried to keep the insects from swarming her light. Every time she breathed, she inhaled the sharp, metallic scent of agitated wings. Tyson retreated,
his shoulders slamming into a wet trunk, but he did not move away. The group huddled closer, shoulder to shoulder, their forms shifting as they ducked and flailed. The humidity seemed to thicken, turning the air into a wet, suffocating weight. They were paralyzed by the sheer, deafening volume of the forest's awakening. The swarm showed no sign of passing.
It only intensified, turning the night into a frantic, buzzing storm that left no room for thought or escape.
The drone of the swarm remained, but Damien stopped flinching. He wiped a hand across his face, clearing the moisture, and looked toward the black surface of the swamp. The damp chill seeped through his skin, a steady, biting cold that made his fingers stiff. He took one step, then another, moving away from the huddled group toward the edge of the water bank. The mud sucked at his feet with every stride, thick and yielding. He did not look back at the others, who remained hunched under the relentless insect cloud. Damien reached the narrow strip of land where the water met the reeds. He unhooked his gear, his movements mechanical and deliberate. He checked the tension on his line, his eyes fixed on the dark, still water rather than the trees. With a sharp, practiced flick of his wrist, he cast the line out into the blackness. The hook hit the surface with a small, clean splash that vanished instantly into the dark. He stood braced against the humidity, ignoring the buzzing wall of sound behind him. He held the line taut between his fingers, waiting for the first vibration to travel up the cord. Was alone at the edge, his focus narrowed entirely to the dark water, hunting for whatever might be moving beneath the surface. The line went taut. Damien pulled back, the rod arching sharply against the resistance. He reeled, the rhythmic click of the mechanism punctuating the heavy air. A dark, sleek shape broke the surface, thrashing as he hauled it onto the mud. He unhooked the fish with a quick, practiced motion and tossed it aside. Before the ripples had even settled, he cast again. The line barely had time to sink before the next bite struck. Again, the rod bent. Again, he hauled a heavy, wet weight onto the bank. He fell into a steady, hypnotic cadence. Cast, pull, release. The pile of catch grew, their scales slick and glistening in the dim light. Each success felt like a victory against the suffocating forest, a tangible proof that he could master this place. He ignored the damp seep of the swamp into his boots and the biting cold of the night. He was catching fish after fish, the frequency increasing until it felt almost effortless. He stood over the growing heap, breathing hard, his movements sharp and energized. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he dominated the bank. He reached for his gear to reset, feeling a surge of misplaced triumph. He was winning, and the dark water seemed to offer up its secrets without further resistance.
The rhythm broke when the next strike hit harder than the rest. Damien braced his weight, pulling the rod upward until the tip groaned under the strain. A massive catfish breached the surface,
its whiskers whipping through the air. He dragged it onto the bank, the creature slapping against the mud with frantic energy. He lunged to pin it, fingers searching for the hook near the gills. Without warning,
the fish arched its back, driving a sharp, serrated stinger deep into his calf. Damien let out a sharp, jagged breath, his hands tightening on the fish until it went limp.
He tossed the carcass aside and looked down at his leg. A thin line of red welled up, seeping into the weave of his pants.
He swiped a palm across the wound, smearing the dark liquid down his leg, and stood back up. The pain pulsed, sharp and hot, but he did not step back. He ignored the stinging sensation,
his focus resetting instantly toward the black water. He reached for his line, his fingers working the knots with renewed intensity. Look are the source of the blood, or check the state of the bank. He simply reset the bait, his eyes locked on the murky surface, waiting for the next ripple to break the silence. The surface of the swamp remained deceptively still. Damien stood rigid, his weight shifted toward the water,
his hand gripping the rod with white-knuckled intensity. A few yards back, Alaya shifted her stance,
her flashlight beam cutting a jagged path through the heavy, humid air. She swept the light across the damp bank, seeking the rest of the group, until the beam snagged on Damien's leg. She paused,
the light trembling slightly as it centered on his calf. A dark, viscous trail of red leaked from the puncture wound,
sliding down his skin and pooling into the black, stagnant water at his feet. The liquid did not simply dissipate. It swirled into the murk, creating a thin,
widening ribbon of color that drifted slowly toward the center of the channel. Alaya's breath hitched. She pushed the beam closer,
watching the blood churn and dilute into the swamp. The light illuminated the murky depths, where the dark stain began to draw out into the black water like a beckoning signal. Damien did not notice, his gaze still fixed on his line, but the rest of the group froze. The air grew heavy,
thick with the scent of metallic iron that began to rise from the water's edge, signaling the invisible presence beneath the surface.
The constant drone of the swamp insects, which had been a deafening wall of sound for hours, vanished. It did not fade or taper off. It simply ceased, as if a switch had been flipped.
The sudden vacuum of sound was more jarring than a scream. Ashley stepped forward, her boots making a wet,
sucking noise in the mud that sounded like a gunshot in the new quiet. She looked toward the water, but the surface was perfectly flat, a mirror of black ink. The air turned stagnant, losing its humid flow. Then,
from the bank only a few feet from where Damien stood, a low, wet hiss cut through the stillness.
It was a rhythmic, rattling sound, like air being forced through waterlogged lungs. It was close enough that the vibrations traveled through the ground and into the soles of their feet. Nobody spoke. No one moved. The group stood locked in place, their breathing shallow and jagged, all eyes fixed on the point where the hiss originated. The darkness seemed to thicken, pressing in around them. Another hiss followed, longer this time, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic sound of heavy weight shifting on the bank. The predator was no longer hiding in the depths. It was waiting in the shadows, inches from the light. The stillness held for a heartbeat, then Damien shifted his weight. The mud beneath his boot gave a soft,
wet crunch. That single sound was the trigger. From the black water, just inches from the bank, the surface exploded. A massive shape, dark and jagged as a fallen log, surged upward with terrifying speed. It cleared the water in a single fluid arc, a wall of armored muscle and teeth that eclipsed the flashlight beams. The air hissed as the predator lunged, its movement a blur of raw, unchecked power. Damien had no time to shout, no time to raise his hands in defense. The alligator closed the distance instantly, its jaws snapping open like a steel trap. In a violent, wet surge of motion, the creature slammed into him with the force of a falling tree. The impact threw him backward. Before he could find his footing, the massive head clamped down. The jaws locked shut with a sickening, heavy thud around his head. He was hoisted off the ground, his body jerking upward as the alligator's momentum carried them both toward the edge of the bank. The water churned beneath them, boiling into a frothing black vortex as the predator took its grip. The weight of the predator pulled Damien sideways, his heels carving deep, frantic furrows into the soft mud of the bank. He clawed at the air, his fingers finding nothing but the humid, heavy darkness. But the alligator's grip was absolute. With a violent, thrashing motion, the beast pivoted, dragging him toward the center of the channel. The water rose up to meet them, swallowing his legs, then his waist. In a flurry of black spray, Damien vanished beneath the surface with a muffled,
choking splash that sent ripples radiating outward. For a second, the group stood frozen.
Flashlights trembling in their grip as the light danced uselessly over the churned, swirling mud. Ashley shouted,
but the sound died in her throat as she watched the water turn opaque and dark. Elia dropped her light.
The beam spinning on the bank and pointing toward the tree line. Tyson and Dana stood paralyzed, their eyes wide.
Watching the exact spot where the bubbles now rose to the surface, the silence returned to the swamp, heavier and more suffocating than before, broken only by the rhythmic, bubbling intake of air from the depths.
There was no struggle left, only the chilling realization that the water had claimed its target.
The surface of the black water continued to churn, a violent, rotating vortex that refused to settle. Then,
the sound arrived, a sharp, dry crack that sliced through the humid air like a gunshot.
It was the sickening sound of bones snapping under immense pressure, echoing clearly through the dense trees and across the marsh.
The group stood motionless, their breath hitching in the sudden, heavy stillness that followed. Below the waterline,
the movement intensified. The dark liquid began to boil, bubbling and frothing as more shapes emerged from the shadows beneath the bank.
These were not singular ripples, but a rhythmic, surging disturbance that signaled the arrival of others.
The water turned opaque, swirling with debris and blood that spread outward in widening. Dark plumes. Ashley gripped her flashlight until her knuckles turned white, the beam catching the frantic motion of the surface.
Dana and Tyson took a step back, their heels sinking into the soft, wet earth.
The swamp was no longer a place of quiet decay. It had become an active, predatory hunting ground.
The water slapped against the bank, the sound of teeth grinding against bone now constant, rhythmic, and terrifyingly close.
Every inch of the channel was alive with movement, closing in on the spot where the initial impact had occurred. The realization hit them in unison. The bank was no longer safe. Ashley turned, her boots sliding on the slick mud as she bolted toward the massive cypress tree standing 10 feet away. She slammed into the trunk,
her breath hitching as the wood felt damp and slick under her palms. She ignored the burn in her muscles and drove her fingers into the deep,
fibrous crevices of the bark, pulling with everything she had. Her feet scrambled for a foothold, slipping once against the mossy base, before she found a knot in the wood. She hauled her body upward, the rough bark scraping her palms, her eyes fixed on the lower branches. Below her, the water surged, a chaotic mass of dark shapes colliding against the roots of the tree. She felt the vibration of a heavy impact against the trunk, the entire cypress swaying under the force of something large striking it from the dark. She climbed faster, her hands clawing, her lungs burning, refusing to look back at the churning black water. She reached the first solid branch and swung her leg over, pulling herself into the canopy.
From this height, she looked down. The swamp surface was a boiling cauldron, unrecognizable in its intensity, with dozens of shapes weaving through the roots where she had stood only seconds before. Elia stood frozen at the base of the cypress, her eyes fixed on the boiling water just inches from her feet.
The scent of wet decay was overwhelming. She reached up, her fingers desperate to find a grip on the gnarled wood.
A branch hung just above her reach, damp and slick with emerald moss. She pushed off the ground, her muscles coiled for the jump, and hooked her fingers around the wood. It held for a heartbeat. Then the moss detached in a thick, wet sheet under her weight.
Her hand skidded across the bark, losing all friction. She tried to pivot, to dig her nails into the trunk.
But her foot found no purchase on the saturated roots. She swung outward, her body twisting in the air. The grip failed completely. She clawed at the air, her heels catching on nothing but the humid mist, and she tipped backward. Gravity took over. She plummeted toward the churning dark surface, her arms outstretched, eyes wide. The water rose up to meet her, a cold, black wall of movement. She hit the surface with a heavy splash, the impact muffled by the sudden, violent agitation of the swamp around her. She did not have time to scream before the water folded over her, hiding her from view.
Elia breached the surface, her lungs gasping for air. reaching blindly toward the overhanging branches.
Her fingers grazed the rough wood, but the water beneath her feet offered no stability.
Two distinct ripples cut through the surface, converging on her position from opposite sides. She turned, her eyes tracking the movement.
But the predators were already closing the distance. The swamp went silent.
The only sound, the rhythmic slap of water against the cypress roots. As she kicked, trying to propel herself toward the trunk.
The water erupted in a synchronized strike. Two sets of jaws emerged from the black depths, snapping shut with a force that sent water spraying into the air. The sound of the impact was sharp, a hollow,
crushing noise that echoed through the trees. Elia vanished beneath the surface instantly. There was no struggle.
No second attempt to surface. The churning movement intensified, spreading outward from the spot where she had been. The water began to darken, a thick, expanding plume of red swirling into the black depths.
Visible even in the dim light of the swamp. From their high branches the survivors watched,
their breathing shallow and jagged as the water slowly resumed its unnatural pulsing motion. Below them, the swamp was hungry again.
Dana pushed upward, her boots scraping against the rough cypress bark as she climbed toward the higher, thinner branches. Tyson followed close behind, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. They reached a fork where the wood felt sturdier, though it groaned under their combined weight. Below them, the water remained a churning, dark expanse, stained deeply by the recent violence. They pressed their backs against the trunk, limbs trembling. Dana covered her mouth with both hands, her teeth digging into her palms to stifle the sound of her breath. Beside her, Tyson stared downward, his eyes locked on the spot where the water still swirled. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against a branch, his shoulders heaving with silent, rhythmic gasps. The swamp seemed to hold its breath. A single bubble broke the surface below, followed by the faint, wet sound of something shifting against the roots. They did not move. They did not speak. They watched as the red bloom in the water began to dissipate into the black depths, leaving only the dark, still surface behind. Every muscle in their bodies remained locked in place, braced against the height, as they waited for the next movement from the shadows below.
The sun vanished, leaving the swamp in a thick, suffocating darkness. High in the cypress,
the survivors remained motionless, their presence reduced to the slow, shallow intake of air. Then the silence broke.
A low, guttural growl vibrated through the mud, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled in the chest.
It was followed by a wet, tearing noise from the dark water below. The swamp had become a theater of rhythmic violence. Every few seconds, the sharp, grinding crack of teeth meeting bone echoed through the canopy, followed by the heavy splash of a tail hitting the surface. The sound was constant, mechanical, and relentless. It did not stop. It did not pause. Below the trees, shapes moved in the black water, their presence betrayed only by the displaced liquid and the wet, slapping sounds of movement.
The air grew heavy with the smell of decay. Dana gripped the branch so hard her knuckles turned white.
Her eyes fixed on the impenetrable dark. Tyson shifted his weight, and the branch groaned.
A sharp protest that made them both freeze. They stayed like that for hours, suspended in the dark, listening to the methodical, rhythmic feast that played out beneath them in the depths of the swamp. The rhythmic grinding finally ceased, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. The swamp air turned cold.
Clinging to the skin like damp silk, Ashley shifted her position,
her fingers digging deep into the cypress bark as she leaned forward. Below, the water did not merely settle. It stagnated into an oily,
obsidian mirror. She squinted, forcing her eyes to adjust to the dim, filtered moonlight.
The surface was deceptive in its stillness. Beneath that smooth, black veneer, the water vibrated. She saw the subtle displacement of liquid, a slow, rhythmic pushing of ripples against the cypress roots that did not come from the wind. There were shapes, many shapes. They moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, circling the base of the trees. They were not feeding anymore. They were waiting. The water churned in small, localized bursts as submerged forms shifted, their presence betrayed by the faint, wet friction of scale against wood.
Ashley pressed her forehead against the rough branch, her breath coming in shallow, jagged bursts.
She looked at the others, her eyes wide. They were not alone in the trees. The swamp had become a trap, and the dark water below was alive with the patient, unseen presence of the predators gathering in the shadows. Fear had turned into a physical weight. Ashley felt her muscles locking, cramping from hours of unnatural stillness.
Every nerve ending in her body pulsed with the effort of staying upright. Beside her, Dana was trembling so violently that the branch she gripped began to vibrate with a faint,
rhythmic clicking against the trunk. They were past the point of panic. The terror had calcified, settling deep into their bones until they were little more than statues of frozen intent below.
The water remained unnervingly still, yet the occasional wet slap of a tail against a root confirmed the predators were still there.
Drifting in the blackness, the air felt thin, sharp with the scent of stagnant mud and swamp gas.
Ashley tried to shift her weight, but her leg buckled, her foot sliding inches down the mossy bark before she caught herself. She gasped, a sound that seemed to ring out like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet.
She clamped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide, listening for a reaction from below.
The water remained silent, but the sense of being watched intensified. Beheld their breath,
waiting for the next movement, paralyzed by the knowledge that any slip now would be their final error.
Hours bled into one another, measured only by the deepening ache in their joints.
The bark had long since scraped away the surface of their skin, leaving raw, stinging patches that throbbed with every shallow breath.
Their bodies were heavy, coated in a thick, drying layer of swamp mud that cracked whenever they moved. Every muscle fiber strained against the inevitable pull of gravity. Tyson hung lower than the others,
his fingers white-knuckled against a narrow fork in the cypress. He was shivering, a slow,
rhythmic tremor that shook his entire frame and threatened to dislodge his precarious hold.
Ashley watched him, her own grip failing as her fingers lost all sensation. She tried to pull herself higher,
but her legs were leaden, unresponsive to the frantic commands of her mind. They were trapped in a state of terminal fatigue. The humidity had soaked into their bones, making every movement a gamble against the dark water below.
They remained pinned against the wood, exhausted and failing,
watching the horizon for a sliver of light that refused to appear. The silence of the swamp was absolute, broken only by the ragged,
uneven rhythm of their collective struggle to stay above the reach of the waiting shapes.
The darkness finally began to thin, replaced by a dull, gray luminescence that filtered through the swamp canopy.
It did not bring warmth. Instead, the first touch of dawn carried a damp, biting chill that seeped into the marrow of their bones.
Tyson felt the change immediately. His muscles, long strained and deprived of blood flow,
began to lock. A sharp, involuntary cramp seized his right forearm, forcing his fingers to straighten against his will. He gritted his teeth, pressing his face into the rough wood, trying to force his hand to curl back into a hook.
His jaw felt heavy, clicking as he tried to suppress a groan. The gray light revealed the water below,
flat and motionless like a sheet of hammered lead. Every breath he took rattled in his chest.
Shallow and controlled. He could see his fingers trembling, the skin pale and unresponsive to his mental commands.
Beside him, Ashley remained motionless, her eyes darting across the gray expanse of the marsh. The light grew stronger,
turning the mist into a thick, suffocating veil. Tyson adjusted his weight, but his knee refused to bend.
Seized by the same cold-induced stiffness, he stared down at the black water, watching the surface for any sign of movement, his body fighting a silent, internal war against the creeping paralysis of the swamp. The sun remained hidden behind a thick blanket of gray mist, yet the light was enough to illuminate the slick, wet texture of the cypress bark. Tyson's right hand was no longer his own. It was a claw of frozen,
unresponsive tissue. He felt the shift before he saw it, a subtle loosening of his index finger against the wood. He tried to compensate by digging his nails deeper, but the surface was saturated with overnight condensation. His middle finger flicked outward, sliding across the damp moss. He gasped, the sound sharp and ragged in the stagnant air. He lunged with his left hand, trying to grab a higher knot in the wood, but his shoulder muscles failed to fire. His arm hung limp, dead weight pulling him away from the trunk. The branch beneath his feet groaned under the sudden shift in balance. He tilted, his torso swinging away from the safety of the main tree, every fiber of his being screamed for his hand to tighten, to lock, to hold. He stared at his own fingers as they began to peel away, one by one, from the bark. The friction was gone. His hand slipped another inch, then another, the skin sliding over the wet wood with a sickening, slow crawl. He was losing the fight against gravity, his strength finally exhausted by the long, brutal night.
The last anchor point snapped. His skin lost its final friction against the damp wood, and the weight of his body took over.
Tyson did not scream. He did not cry out. The air rushed past his ears as he tumbled backward,
his torso spinning slowly in the heavy, humid morning mist. His hands clawed at the empty space, fingers grasping for a branch that was already feet above him. For a fraction of a second, his shoulder brushed against a lower, moss-covered limb, but there was no purchase, no resistance, only the smooth, slick slide of bark against skin. He continued to drop, his eyes locked on the dark, unmoving surface of the water below. His body hit the swamp with a sudden, sharp splash that broke the unnatural stillness of the clearing. There was no struggle, no thrashing, and no shout for help. The water parted, swallowed his form completely,
and then closed over him without leaving a ripple. The silence that followed was absolute.
Heavier than it had been before. Ashley and Dana remained locked in the upper branches, their gaze fixed on the exact point where the dark water had reclaimed the space. Every muscle in their bodies remained rigid, waiting for a sound that never came, as the morning mist continued to drift slowly over the stagnant surface. The ripples expanded in perfect widening circles, eventually dissolving into the black expanse of the swamp. Seconds ticked by, then 10, then 20. The water remained undisturbed, as if the surface had never been broken.
Ashley and Dana did not move. They pressed their chests against the wet cypress, lungs barely expanding, eyes tracing the dark patch where the water had surged. They were the last two left.
The air felt thick, charged with the weight of what had just occurred. Then the stillness shattered. A massive,
muscular tail broke the surface with a thunderous slap, sending a spray of brackish water into the mist.
The sound echoed off the trees, a sharp, wet crack that signaled the end of the hunt. No other movement followed. No thrashing, no bubbles, only the settling of the swamp as the surface glassed over once more.
The creatures had retreated into the depths, satisfied. Ashley looked over at Dana, who remained frozen,
her gaze fixed on the water. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a grave.
They were alone in the canopy, listening to the slow drip of dew from the leaves,
waiting for the courage to descend, knowing that the path back to solid ground was now entirely their own to carve. The sun climbed higher, yet the swamp refused to shed its shroud. A thick, gray mist clung to the water, obscuring the horizon and muffling the distant sounds of the forest. Ashley shifted her weight,
her limbs stiff and unresponsive from hours of immobility. She leaned forward,
squinting through the shifting veil of vapor that swirled between the cypress trunks. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. She scanned the jagged tree line, looking for any break in the monotonous wall of green. A slow breeze pushed against the mist, thinning it out for a brief, fleeting moment. She focused on a rise in the distance, past the reach of the dark, stagnant pools. There, rising against the pale sky, was a vertical line.
It was thin, translucent, and steady. Ashley blinked, steadying her gaze, and confirmed the movement.
It was smoke, a narrow, dark column drifting upward from a hidden point beyond the marshland. She felt the sudden, sharp shift in the atmosphere. The swamp, once an inescapable cage, now offered a single, fragile point of direction. She locked her eyes onto the drift of the smoke, memorizing its position as the mist began to thicken once more, threatening to swallow the trail before she could commit it to memory.
Ashley tapped Dana on the shoulder, her fingers trembling. She pointed toward the distant rising smoke.
Dana looked, then nodded, her face gaunt and pale. Ashley began on the descent first. She pressed her palms into the rough, slime-covered bark of the cypress, testing each foothold before shifting her weight. The tree was slick with moss. Her feet slipped twice, forcing her to hug the trunk until her breath returned. She reached a lower branch, then dropped to the mud with a soft thud. Dana followed, but halfway down, her grip faltered. She slid, her boots scraping against the wood, and let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. Ashley lunged forward, catching her arm and pulling her downward until both stood on the swamp floor. Their feet sank immediately into the cold, black muck. The smell of rot was overwhelming, thick enough to taste, but they ignored it. Ashley did not look back at the water. She grabbed Dana's hand, squeezed it once to signal the path, and they turned away from the trees. Every muscle in their legs was rigid, strained from hours of tension. They began to move, pushing through the dense, tangled undergrowth with heavy, frantic steps, driven by the thin, gray line of smoke drifting in the distance. They broke from the cover of the trees into the open marsh. The ground here was uneven, a treacherous patchwork of tall, razor-edged grass and hidden pools. Ashley lunged forward, her lungs burning with every jagged breath. Dana kept pace, her boots slapping wetly against the mud. They hit a patch of soft, black peat that grabbed their feet with unnatural force. Ashley stumbled, her knees slamming into the muck, but she shoved herself upright before the suction could take hold. She grabbed Dana by the wrist, hauling her through the tangle of reeds. The smoke was closer now, a steady gray signal against the sky. They pushed past the pain in their chests, their legs moving with a desperate, heavy rhythm. Every muscle burned, but they did not stop. They bypassed a cluster of submerged logs, vaulting over the debris without breaking stride. The marsh seemed to pull at them, trying to keep them in the dark, but the sight of the clearing ahead drove them forward. They sprinted, their pace erratic and frantic, feet pounding the sodden earth as they raced toward the solid ground that waited just beyond the final ridge of the swamp. The wooden structure loomed ahead, solid and unmoving against the mist. Ashley saw the door, a dark rectangle of potential sanctuary. Her feet hammered the final yards of dry, packed earth, her chest heaving with every ragged intake of air. She reached the threshold, her fingers clawing at the wood. She grabbed the handle and pulled, but it held firm, swollen shut by the damp.
A spark of raw panic flared. She threw her entire body weight against the frame, grunting as the wood groaned under the pressure.
With a sharp snap of the latch, the door swung inward. Ashley stumbled inside, pulling Dana across the threshold behind her. They collapsed onto the floorboards, their legs giving way instantly. The transition from the open, hostile marsh to the enclosed space was jarring. Ashley scrambled upright, her hands shaking, and grabbed the heavy iron bolt. She shoved it into place with a hollow, metallic thud that signaled the end of their flight. They hit the floor again, backs against the timber walls, their breathing loud and uneven in the sudden,
suffocating quiet of the room. The swamp was gone. The silence of the cabin replaced it.
Thick and absolute, as the adrenaline drained from their limbs, leaving them trembling on the hard wood. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of pine pitch and wood smoke. Ashley pushed herself up, her palms sliding against the rough floorboards.
She wiped her face, leaving a smear of dark mud across her skin. Dana sat huddled beside her, knees pulled to her chest, shivering as the heat from the hearth washed over them.
Then the sound of a low, rhythmic popping came from the corner of the room. Ashley froze.
A man stood by the stone fireplace, his back to the room, poking at the embers with a long iron rod.
He did not turn. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Ashley tried to speak, but her throat was raw, producing only a dry, rattling gasp. The man stopped moving.
He slowly straightened, his shoulders broad and still. He turned to face them. His eyes traveled from Ashley to Dana, lingering on the dark stains on their faces and the jagged tears in their skin.
He did not ask what had happened. He did not reach out. He simply stared, his face a mask of iron-gray stone. Watching the blood drip slowly onto the floorboards, the fire flared, casting long, jumping shadows that danced across his motionless form, while the two survivors watched him, paralyzed by the weight of his gaze.
The man remained a statue in the firelight. He did not blink. Ashley gripped the edge of the door frame, her knuckles white, and pulled herself to her feet. Her legs buckled, but she forced them to hold. She reached for the heavy iron bolt once more, sliding it back and forth to ensure it was locked deep into the jamb. The sharp, metallic click echoed through the room.
A definitive sound that severed the connection to the world outside. She leaned her weight against the wood, listening for any sound from the marsh. The wind had died. The insects were absent. There was only the low,
steady hiss of the hearth fire. She turned back to the room. The man had not shifted his position by a single inch. He stood as if he had been waiting for them, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The silence within the cabin was no longer merely quiet. It was dense, pressing in against their ears like deep water. Ashley slid down the door until she hit the floor again, her breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the logs turning to ash. Outside, the swamp was gone. Inside, the stillness tightened, absolute and cold, as they sat in the dim light, waiting for the dawn to reveal if they were truly alone.